Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. Today we read from Acts chapter 23. Paul has been brought before the council of the Jewish chief priests and the elders to give an account based on the Roman tribune wanting to know what in the world's going on with this event. And looking intently at the council, Paul said, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God on all good conscience up to this day." The high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck?" Those who stood by said, "Would you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.'" Now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial." When he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, "We find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or angel has spoken to him?" And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force, and bring him into the barracks. The following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." When it was day, the Jews made a plot, and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near." Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand and going aside asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things." Then he called 2 of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor." And he wrote a letter to this effect: "Claudius Lysias, to his excellency the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about the questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him." So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul before them. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive." And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. This is the word of the Lord. So our text today again begins with Paul attempting to speak to his accusers. Now they're not a rioting crowd, but the Jewish council, the Jewish ruling council. He tells them that he's lived in good conscience before God up to this day, which is an interesting thing for him to say, because we know how much his persecution of the church in the past had pained his conscience, that grief that he bore. And that alone could be his thorn in the flesh that he asked God to remove from him. We don't really know what that thorn was. The high priest Ananias commands him to be struck. Paul responds very harshly, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. So you may strike Paul, but Paul declares that God is going to strike you. I'd rather be struck by man than by God. Now, the whitewashed wall part is something Jesus called the Pharisees back in Matthew 23 as he spoke woe over the Pharisees and the scribes. It's the picture, essentially it's the picture of vanity, of looking good on the outside while you're empty on the inside, or rotten on the inside. Jesus specifically said a whitewashed tomb. So you think of a tomb, the Jews are not supposed to go near the tombs, especially not around the time of the Sabbath or the Passover as it was at that point, because they'd be unclean. Because tombs are unclean, but it's like you polish the outside, even though it's rotting, it's decaying, it's unclean. And so this man, this high priest, which Paul's unaware of at the moment, has made himself look clean on the outside, but Paul speaks the judgment that is about to come upon him by the Lord. And that's probably a fair and true statement. I don't know that this high priest ever repents and trusts in God. Paul's argument is that they sit to judge him by the law, and yet they would contradict the law by harming him. That's not the Jewish process. We've seen apparently that's the Roman process, is they were willing to flog Paul as part of their interrogation. Really, as their interrogation. There wasn't an interrogation apart from that. So the Jews are acting in a Gentile way, even though that was what incensed them the day before. That Paul would speak to the Gentiles this gospel. It's pointed out to him that Ananias is the high priest, and so Paul apologizes. In a sense. The word sorry or anything like a confession is not there, but he walks it back a bit. He seeks to respect the law as he cites to them Exodus 22:28. Now, Paul at that point notes that there's a split in this group. Some are Sadducees, some are Pharisees, and he decides he's going to play that split. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They don't believe in angels. They don't believe in anything really spiritual at all. And the Pharisees do, and so Paul plays on that. He says he's on trial on account of the resurrection of the dead. And so the Pharisees suddenly take his side, and the Sadducees are opposed. And a commotion rises among them. The Pharisees are willing to let him go. They even, in a sense, agree with Gamaliel's advice from back in Acts chapter 5. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? The tribune has to get him out of there as the room became violent and he feared Paul would be torn to pieces. The tribune still doesn't have the answer to his curiosity at this point. God speaks to Paul the next evening. Take courage. He encourages him, quite literally. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome. There's more coming for Paul. He's done his 3 missionary journeys. Now he's going to take the gospel even to Caesar himself. This is a question at this point for our kids. If you were arrested or even just made fun of, you can walk it back. Even just made fun of for talking about Jesus, would you be willing to talk about Jesus again? This is our call. It's a call that we need to get used to. It's a call that as a church we've, in a comfortable culture that for the most part respected Christian belief, we kind of grew soft. And so now today we see so few people willing to do this, to speak of Christ, because they're afraid. But again, this is our call. And Jesus himself is not soft on this. He says that anyone who is afraid, who is ashamed to confess him before men, Jesus will not confess before his Father in heaven. So we as a church, in our community, in our homes, we need to pray to the Lord that he would give us that boldness, that we would be willing to speak of him no matter the consequence. Losing a friendship, losing a job, losing our home and our freedoms, whatever it may be. We are called to give thanks to God always, and to know that he is for us, that he is with us, and that he has saved us from really worse than anything that the world can do to us. So the Jews then make a plot to kill Paul. They bind themselves by an oath, and by Old Testament law, you have to keep your oath. You've made it to God, which is going to be interesting here because they're not going to get their wish. Whatever happens to these 40 guys who bind themselves by this oath? They can't kill Paul. They can't eat again until they kill Paul. And they tell that to the chief priests and the elders, so the rulers of the people know about their oath. I wonder if they went back on it or not. To go back on it would be to break your oath before God, which is an extreme sin. But to not go back on it would mean that they would end up dying of starvation. Anyway, the chief priests and the elders know about the plot. Question for your kids: should the rulers of the people be involved in a plot to murder someone? The answer to that is no. Follow-up question, though: who else have the rulers of this people, the chief priests and the elders, who else have they plotted to kill before? Which gets you thinking about Jesus, the gospel accounts, and really Holy Week and the crucifixion. They seek to take advantage of the curiosity of that tribune, that there's going to be another hearing. They're digging into this more, but it's all a ruse. They're going to lie in ambush to kill Paul on the way. Now, Paul's nephew hears of it. That's the first we've heard of Paul's family. I wonder if they're faithful, if they believe, or if this is just Paul's family sticking up for family. He goes and he reports to Paul, who reports it to a centurion, who then sends this boy or young man off to the tribune, and the tribune learns of the plot. He sends Paul's nephew away, charging him to tell no one else about what's happening. The tribune then collects together quite an escort: 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen, to take Paul from there to Caesarea, where he would stand trial before the governor Felix. Now, Caesarea is 55 miles off to the northwest of Jerusalem. The third hour of the night would be a reference to 9 p.m. And again, what a procession. Those 40 Jews aren't going to overwhelm this small army. I mean, we've got 470 trained Roman soldiers. providing escort to safety. We finally get the tribune's name, which is uncommon, right? Oftentimes, even in the gospel accounts, when we see the people Jesus heals, we don't get their names, but especially the Romans. And here we get a tribune's name, Claudius Lysias. He writes a letter to Felix, the governor of Judea, from 52 to 60 AD, to explain to him what's going on. You can ask your kids, what does he leave out of the letter as he recounts what's happened with Paul and the Jewish crowds? He leaves a couple of details out. He leaves it out that he arrested him, that he bound him, that he was about to flog him. That would have gotten him in trouble. So he leaves that out conveniently. He admits his desire to know what's going on in the situation, and he's sent Paul off to Felix that he might have a hearing before Felix and his accusers, that Claudius has found nothing deserving death or imprisonment himself. Now, they take Paul, and they bring him to Antipatris, which is still 30 miles south of Caesarea, so about halfway. And then they send him the rest of the way the next day. Felix reads the letter and agrees to give Paul a hearing when the accusers join him. He commands Paul to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. Now, a praetorium is the residence of a Roman governor, so Herod built this when he was governor of Judea. The question could be here whether or not Felix is using this as his praetorium, so his governor home, his place of residence. And he may, but he also may not. It may still just be a Roman official building that is used for other purposes, as he has his own praetorium. That's not mentioned here in the text.